Hi, I'm Pamita Rashid, Senior Writer at CSO Online. I'm at Black Hat today, and Kelly Shortridge just gave a talk on game theory and how it influences security. So Kelly, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So game theory is about how people are rational and how they make decisions. I didn't think people were rational.
They aren't, and that's part of the problem. We've relied a lot on Game Theory 101, as I called it, to make decisions, but that isn't the right way to think about it. So it's not only considering that the defensive side may be somewhat irrational, but also that attackers have weird sorts of biases and ways that they actually make their decisions, and thinking about how can you start to leverage some of that to your advantage.
So are you essentially looking for mistakes that hackers are making, or is there something a little bit more when you talk about their decisions?
It's a little bit more. So the way people make decisions, anyone, is either through thinking or learning. So thinking either ahead about how someone will act, or learning over time how someone's behaved based on observation. And with attackers, they are learning over time. They have to get some sort of feedback. If you start to obfuscate that feedback or falsify it, you start to really mess with how well they can actually learn.
So in a way, you're just kind of manipulating what they think they're getting. It's not, maybe deception is not the right word, but you're saying that, hey, normally if you type in this command, this is what you hear back. If you can manipulate that, if you can give them a wrong feedback, they'll make the wrong decision.
Correct. So I think deception is somewhat accurate, and an example I gave is a lot of malware these days scans for VMs to see if there's some sort of, if they're in a malware analyst sandbox. And what you have to think about is, rather than having a bunch of different sandboxes, what if you just make everything look like a sandbox? Because a lot of times malware is simply written, they'll just look for a certain string that's on the system. So if you just put those strings on every system, the malware won't run. So it's,
that's a great defense.
Yeah. So it's flooding the attacker with a lot of information, or as I put it, it's putting wolf skin on the sheep.
Okay. So again, we're talking here about how the hackers are thinking, changing their mind. But how do we know what they're thinking to even know what kind of false data to feed them?
It's a great question. Another interesting example, and I think there's more work to be done here, is if you have some sort of email protection solution, you can actually customize messages that are sent back if it's something suspicious. So reference, the Cisco 12345 policy, put a honey token online, that's a fake policy document. You actually get an early warning system when someone receives that suspicious email. They'll look up the fake policy, and you can start to see how they're thinking through their attack.
Interesting. So in a way, you're combining not just deception technology, you're doing a lot of the honeypots, a lot of the things that we used to do in the past, sort of as a one-on-one.
Yes.
You're suggesting that we should be kind of combining all of them.
Exactly. I think the goal is to really disrupt the attacker's learning process, make them unable to profile you, or a fancier way of putting it is making them unable to test their hypotheses, and you can do that through spoofing, obfuscation, honey tokens, all sorts of stuff.
So in security, I think the big thing right now is the kill chain and how the attackers follow a very set path. Is that still relevant in this concept of, okay, this is when we get involved, this is how we trick the adversary? Do we still think in terms of the kill chain?
I think it's essential. One other idea to talk about are decision trees, which I've referenced before, and in doing so, in building the decision trees, you do want to think about what are the steps attackers take, because from a defensive point of view, you want to consider what the countermeasures are, and the goal really is to think about, in a kill chain diagram, how do you make it the most expensive, hardest kill chain possible? As I put it, how do you make it ODay all the way down? How do you force them to just blow a ton of money and time on things? So I think that's not really how defenders think today, but that's how attackers think about things.
And I mean, we were talking earlier about how attackers are going for the low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
But if you're making everything expensive, there is no more low-hanging fruit.
Correct, and naturally attackers adapt. You implement things like ASLR or EMET, attackers learn how to bypass them, but it still ups the game, and at the very least it'll buy you some time, I think quite a bit of time, but that's absolutely what we need to move towards.
Okay. So again, kind of going back to the original game theory, you used a different phrase. You said it was a behavioral game theory.
Yes.
So can you kind of define that and explain that a little bit?
Sure, so behavioral game theory, just like behavioral economics, it looks to experimental evidence of how people actually behave, so not just theory. An important point from my talk is that game theory is a language. You can use it to describe games and describe scenarios, for example, the InfoSec game, but it isn't until you start to bring in data from behavioral experiments until you can start to really come up with strategy.
Right. So again, I mean, we're talking about behavioral economics. That's not normally a security thing. When we talk about security, we're talking networking, we're talking about infection, forensic. You're actually bringing in something that's economic, that's a little bit of psychology. Do you find that a tougher sell?
Sometimes it is, so I think the basic premise of economics is it's the study of choice. I think people are starting to understand that the human factors on both sides are extremely important. Obviously there are costs on either side, you have budgets on either side. So I think people are coming around to the notion, and particularly I think it's pretty obvious that we have the same sort of status quo that we've had for years and years, so it's time for what I call like returning to first principles, thinking about kind of a new philosophy of defense.
So I'm really loving the fact that a lot of things we're talking about really echoed what happened at this morning keynote.
Yes.
When Alex Stamos, CISO of Facebook, he's talking about how we need to think about how users use technology. Stop focusing on the O days.
Yes.
Focus on the real issues. So
Exactly.
how did you feel when you heard that?
I pretty much entirely agreed with it. I've talked about that a lot in my prior talks, particularly looking at prospect theory, how defenders are inclined to focus on the really niche stuff, but we shouldn't be. I think a lot of his points echoed really well. I think in general, looking to try to measure defensive efficacy is really important. I feel like that was a takeaway that I got, is that you need to really start thinking about what is actually working rather than what sounds really fancy.
And I think that's actually the best takeaway anyone can take when we can't keep doing the same
Yes.
stuff. So if it means going to economics, if it means checking out the social sciences for new technique, understanding the mindset, it seems like the next logical step for us to go.
I would hope so, and again, in that decision tree model, what's useful is it actually helps you audit your own thinking. So you're basically mapping out all your assumptions of what will happen. So after an incident, you can go back and say, okay, this assumption was off or this was off, and it means that you won't start to double down or just keep adding security product after security.
And that's the way you learn.
Yes.
Just because an incident went one way or the other doesn't mean the next incident is going to unfold the same way.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Well, again, Kelly, thank you so much for your time.
you.
I think this was a really helpful understanding.
Yeah,
So,
thank you again
yeah.
for having me.
For more on behavioral game theory, follow us on idg.tv and CSO Online.